My name's Alison Ota. I'm the director, and it's very nice to see you all here this evening. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Liz Driver, who is a long-standing member of the Society and has served on council and is serving on council actually currently, and is on the Finance Committee. And for those of you who are not aware of her background, is that Liz trained as a pathologist and then became a lawyer working on medical product liability cases. She's also a freeman of the City of London and a liveryman of the Solicitors Company. However, more importantly, she has organised and bravely led 2 tours of RAS fellows to India. So I think that's your main. Exactly. So the first one was our bicentenary tour, which was in the footsteps of James Todd. And we had a wonderful time in Rajasthan. She is extremely devoted in terms of her planning. She takes us to places which, you know, we would never get there by ourselves. And, you know, down bumpy roads and, you know, all sorts of places like that. And in the second tour we did follow Todd, who was the Society's first librarian, his travels in Western India. So we travelled around Gujarat. And again, all had tremendous fun and lots of laughter. So it's sort of my 2 weeks of laughing going with you, and it's very good for me mentally. And now we're going on our third foray into India. And this time, because we've run out of things to do on Todd, yes, we're doing Elphinstone and Malcolm. And are we doing Wellesleys?
Not really.
No, not really.
The Elphinstone and Malcolm.
So
now about the Wellesleys.
So very kindly, she has agreed to give us a talk about what we're going to have to know. Actually, we have seminars every evening. So and this is our background for it. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Well, first of all, an apology to those of you who are not coming to India, because Alison's indicated this is really the introduction to the new trip when we no longer follow Todd, who we've got to know and love. So we're looking at the same time period. Todd was in Rajasthan in the early years of the 19th century, dealing with the immediate aftermath of the Maratha and Pindari incursions. And we're now going to consider 2 other East India Company men. They're very different from Todd, and they're very different from each other. But despite that, they were very close friends. Like Todd, they were Scotsmen, and that's not irrelevant to this story. They were passionate about India, they were well read, they wrote copiously themselves, just an idea of what they wrote. Both wrote histories. Malcolm's about his time in Central India, and Elphinstone's is a history of India, which in fact he never completed. He also kept a diary. Both wrote vast numbers of reports and letters, so we're not short of material which gives an insight into their characters, whereas with Todd we were a bit short because we weren't aware of any letters, and those, the personal narratives in the annals are a kind of diary, but it's a very sanitized and edited diary. It's only what he wants you to know. They're very different. Malcolm, who was also the oldest, arrived in India first in 1783, but he then went back to Britain and returned in 1795. Elphinstone arrived shortly afterwards in 1796, and he didn't leave until he retired, so that's 31 years later. And then Todd arrived in 1799, so they overlap quite substantially. I've therefore taken our period of interest for this trip as being the last decade of the 18th century and the first 2 of the 19th. And that period encompasses a period of rapid expansion of British territory, the Third and Fourth Anglo-Mysore Wars and the Second and Third Anglo-Maratha Wars. John Malcolm was the eldest of the three Scotsmen, Elphinstone and Munro being the others, who rose from junior positions in the East India Company to become governors of Bombay and Madras in the early 19th century, whilst Todd was in Rajasthan. And through their military and diplomatic skills, they played key roles in expanding the company's territory and in setting up its administrative structure. All three went out to India very young and with limited education, particularly Malcolm, and they applied their impressive intellects to learning local languages, studying the country, its people, and to governing it, with their approach filtered through a screen of Scottish ideas and assumptions. And in her book on British India and British Scotland, she calls it, Martha McLaren argues that being Scots was central to their shared ideals. It was what she calls their cultural luggage, a product of the Scottish Enlightenment. And both provided tools they could use as a framework for their analyses of Indian culture and government. But of course, it also distorted their interpretation and is one of the reasons for criticism of them. Inevitably, the accusation of Orientalism has been made against the three men, as it was against Todd, and they were undoubtedly Orientalists in the pre-1978 non-pejorative use of that term. However, all three men had the vision to leave things in British India largely as they were, however deficient they might seem to the British, to refrain from excessive interference in the running of the native states, to prohibit British colonisation, and to promote Indians to senior levels in company administration, but above all, to educate Indians to run their own country. And they all wrote remarks about this, but Elphinstone wrote, "The most desirable death for us to die should be the improvement of the natives reaching such a pitch as would render it impossible for a foreign nation to retain the government." Several governors general were in post during this period, although the one who had the most impact on the shape of British India was Richard Wellington, Lord Mornington, later Lord Wellesley, and he was, of course, the elder brother of Arthur, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. The lives of Elphinstone and Malcolm, especially the latter, remained entwined with those of the Wellesley brothers. So let's have a look at them first. The Wellesleys were part of the ascendancy, the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, and our three brothers were the sons of the first Earl of Mornington, who was briefly an MP in the Irish House of Commons, but he was also a composer and a philanthropist, and he got himself into terrible debt. The family seat was Dangan Castle in County Meath, now a burnt-out ruin, and that had been in the family since Henry II. Richard was the eldest son, and he succeeded his father as the second Earl of Mornington. He attended both Eton and Harrow and Christ Church, Oxford, where he became friends with William Greville, future Foreign Secretary, and William Pitt. From Oxford, he went into politics. John Malcolm, whose biography of his ancestor I will quote extensively, and who will hereafter be referred to as J.M., described him as having a neat, delicate figure with large, piercing eyes, which enabled him to dominate men and captivate women. He was sensitive, vain, and could be a bully. His acute intelligence, which did not suffer fools gladly, coupled with his upper-class detachment, combined to give him a wholly justified reputation for arrogance. Philip Woodruff describes him as pompous, humorless, and arrogant. Clearly does not like him at all. So in 1797, Richard Wellesley was appointed Governor-General of India, placing Lord Cornwallis. And on the voyage out, accompanied by his brother Henry as his private secretary, he seems to have become obsessed with the idea of curbing French in India, particularly in the Deccan. They were delayed at the Cape, where he met and was briefed by William Kirkpatrick on sick leave from his post as resident to the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad. He must be held partly responsible for this preoccupation with the French. Richard landed at Madras, where he met John Malcolm, and was clearly impressed by him. He wrote, "Captain Malcolm, the town major, deserves every degree of countenance and protection. He is an officer of great worth, of extremely good sense, and well acquainted with the local languages. He has turned his attention particularly to the political systems of India. He has also the advantage of very pleasing and amiable manners." Not a widely held view, as we will see. Malcolm, from his very modest background, was clearly flattered to have been noticed by such an aristocratic and influential man, who he hero worshipped in a schoolboy kind of way for the rest of his life. He tried to please him, but he didn't get much reaction from the great man. And he wrote to them on one occasion, "Among the various feelings that at present occupy my breast, I recognise with exultation that of a personal attachment to your lordship to be predominant, and I shall glory in every opportunity I shall have of showing the nature of the zeal which that attachment inspires, and how far it places me above the common motives which influence men who are busy in the self-interested pursuit of fortune." I mean, sycophantic doesn't begin to cover it. Arthur Wellesley, this is Richard's younger brother, perhaps because he knew his brother and Malcolm rather better than anyone else and was well aware of their respective flaws, wrote to Malcolm from Vitoria in Spain in 1813, where he must have been rather busy fighting a decisive battle, warning him not to rush back to England before he'd accumulated some money, and advising him, "I likewise recommend you do not fix yourself on Lord Wellesley or any other great man. You are big enough, unless much altered, to walk alone, and you will accomplish your object soonest in that way." Well, at this point, there had already been 3 Anglo-Mysore wars, and shortly after his arrival in India, Richard Wellesley learned of an alliance being negotiated between Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, and the French, which I think he probably overestimated. But he immediately resolved to anticipate the actions of Tipu Sultan and began preparations for war, implementing his controversial forward policy. The first step was to disband the French troops employed by the Nizam of Hyderabad under Raymond, and this was carried out through the diplomacy of James Kirkpatrick, the new resident at Hyderabad. Malcolm wrote a carefully argued paper, Reflections on a Policy of Forming a More Intimate Alliance with the Nizam, in which he set out the opposing ring fence or peace argument, and concluded with Richard Wellesley that this was likely to fail. And this was Malcolm's first bid to become a political, and it so impressed Wellesley that he appointed Malcolm to the post of assistant to the resident of Hyderabad. So he's embarked on his career as a political. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War culminated, not without a good deal of difficulty, with the defeat of Tipu and the acquisition of more territory for the East India Company. Wellesley was rewarded with a marquisate, but an Irish one. He was incandescent, even though it was accompanied by £100,000, enough to pay off even his substantial debts. But he told his common law French wife, Hyacinthe, that it was made him the laughing stock of India, and he turned down the £100,000. Maybe euphoric about the outcome of the Anglo-Mysore War, Wellesley started building Government House, a larger replica of Kedleston, which I've now lost. There we go, there's Kedleston in India, actually bigger than the original Kedleston. It's usually Curzon who gets blamed for extravagance, but Wellesley was at least as bad. The house apparently cost £63,291 exactly, an enormous sum in 1779, and that undoubtedly contributed to Wellesley's downfall. Wellesley is supposed to have said that India should be governed from a palace, not from a country house. Curzon was pretty impressed as well. So we now get to the Anglo-Maratha War. The Governor-General was still sticking to his forward policy, aimed at making Britain the paramount power in India through a series of subsidiary alliances with local rulers. He'd ousted the French from Hyderabad, formed an alliance with the Nizam. He'd already defeated Tipu and replaced him with a puppet Maharaja. He'd annexed the Carnatic and made Oudh and Tanjore into tributary states. So that basically left the Marathas, and by 1805, Holkar alone remained undefeated. Losses had been very heavy on both sides, and particularly in Lord Lake's campaign against Holkar in Hindustan. And a humiliated Monson had been driven to retreat over the Mukundra Pass south of Kota. Todd went to see the Mukundra Pass while he was waiting for the Raja of Kota to come back after the civil war, be crowned, and he commented on the disgrace of Monson's retreat. The directors back in London were merchants. They didn't want more territory acquired at great expense. The wars were inhibiting trade and costing a fortune in both money and lives. So Wellesley's forward policy was not what they wanted. He was recalled and he left India in March 1805 to be replaced by the elderly Lord Cornwallis, Governor-General for the second time. Malcolm was in despair at the loss of his patron and policy he believed in and had fought for, totally discredited. That brings us to Arthur. He was a very different character. By the time he was a boy, their father had died, leaving massive debts. He went very briefly to Eton, which he hated and was considered unpromising, especially by his mother. Luckily, he found his vocation when he attended the French Academy of Equitation in Angers, where he also learnt French, which of course came in very useful later on. Richard got him a commission and he progressed through various regiments in Ireland. Then after an unsuccessful campaign in the Netherlands, he went out to India in 1796, by which time he was already a full colonel. He was in India when he learnt that Richard, his brother, had been appointed Governor-General. Arthur's path crosses repeatedly with those of Elphinstone and Malcolm, and he and Malcolm, who were born within a day of each other, became lifelong friends. J.M. says that despite his later reputation as the Iron Duke, Arthur was in fact rather shy, taciturn and introverted, perhaps why he preferred the company of women. Boy Malcolm, on the other hand, was a typical extrovert and brought a more lighted atmosphere to Arthur's camp, arriving with a brief explosion of jokes. When Arthur arrived in Calcutta, the Governor-General was Sir John Shaw, who Arthur described as a good man, but cold as a greyhound's nose. They didn't get on at all, so it was lucky that Richard came out. Arthur required quite a reputation for having an extremely strong head for drink, and the diarist lawyer William Hickey described some epic drinking sessions. In February 1799, Arthur was appointed as commander of the Nizam's contingent to fight Tipu Sultan, and hence became Malcolm's superior officer. It was then that they became such close friends, with Arthur relying on Malcolm's experience both in battle and with the Indian rulers. They set out on a really long, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a out of focus slide. I couldn't do anything with that, but you can see the length of the journey that they had to make from Mysore to meet up with the Bombay army and the Grand Army, culminating in the siege of Seringapatam, an episode which taught Arthur never to attack an enemy who was prepared and strongly posted, and whose posts have not been reconnoitred in daylight. Nearly a disaster. Despite later accolades, Arthur's command was flawed, and it was by no means certain that the British would win. Ultimately, Tipu was defeated and killed, and Arthur, then aged 30, was left in command of the fort at Seringapatam and had to deal with soldiers drinking and pillaging the fortress and the city with an ardour which John Key says would not have disgraced Attila the Hun. A few floggings and hangings sorted them out, and he remained at Mysore until he was sent to command an army in the Second Anglo-Maratha War. By this time he'd been promoted to rank of Major General, and this time he was accompanied by Elphinstone, not by Malcolm, who was ill. Arthur realised that he had to act decisively in order to defeat the much larger army of the Marathas. He successfully stormed the fort at Ahmednagar, which surrendered, and then pursued the Marathas until they caught up with them at Assaye, south of Ajanta. Assaye was also won against the odds, and an officer in the attack led by Arthur wrote, "The general was in the thick of the action the whole time. I never saw a man as cool and collected as he was, though I can assure you, till our troops got the order to advance, the fate of the day seemed doubtful." And some 1,584 soldiers out of an army of 4,500, so about 35%, were killed or severely wounded at Assaye, and the Maratha losses were much higher, estimated at about 6,000. So a very costly battle. Arthur's men were too exhausted at the end of the battle at Assaye to pursue the retreating Marathas, who still had several thousand horse capable of cutting down anyone who advanced too far. So it wasn't over. And the next problem, of course, was how to find the Marathas again in this vast area of countryside. And intelligence, which was Elphinstone's responsibility, was a nightmare. So they decided the best thing to do was attack the forts in the Deccan chain. There's a whole row of them, with this being one of the main ones. This is Asirgarh, which we're going to see a couple of weeks' time. Burhanpur was captured with no losses, and Asirgarh basically caved in. The walled town under the fort, the Petar, was captured, and within an hour of the siege of the fort commencing, a white flag appeared and the army garrison walked out, and for a sum of money left. So that was an easy victory. There was then a final battle at Argaum, which led to 5,000 enemy dead against only 361 British troops. And there was then another siege, which brought Arthur's time in India to an end and the Anglo-Maratha War to an end. In June 1804, Arthur applied for permission to return home, and he was rewarded for his service in India by being made a Knight of the Bath. He'd also amassed a fortune of £42,000, mainly prize money from his campaigns. And in the event, he and Richard returned to England together in March 1805. Richard in disgrace, of course. And on the way home, rather interestingly, I thought they stopped in St. Helena and stayed in the same house where Napoleon would live and then die in exile. Henry was the fifth and youngest brother, and he went out to India in 1797 with Richard as his private secretary until he was posted to Lucknow, at which point John Malcolm took over as private secretary. J.M. tells us that Malcolm set out to befriend Henry when he arrived in Madras with his brother. Henry was upper class, an old Etonian, much grander socially than Malcolm, but at only 23 to Malcolm's 28. He appreciated and shared Malcolm's youthful high spirits. Malcolm gave him a head start. Sorry. By secretly handing him some of the papers that he'd written on the political situation, anticipating, of course, that Henry would pass them on to Richard, which of course he did. Henry and John Malcolm, sorry. Henry and John Malcolm continued to correspond regularly, and it was often to Henry that Malcolm would write in times of crisis. Henry returned to England in 1803 and I think somewhat unsurprisingly became a successful diplomat and ambassador. So that brings us to Malcolm. John Malcolm came from Eskdale in the Scottish borders, born in 1769, one of 17 children of a tenant farmer and his rather better connected wife, Bonnie Peggy, whose brother was Admiral Sir Thomas Pashley. John's brother, Pulteney, the elder brother, also became an admiral. The eldest brother, George, sailed for Madras in 1779, aged 15, and John was only 11 when an invitation came to join the Madras army. He was sent first to his uncle in London, who felt that he needed some education before he went off to India. But he landed in Madras in April 1783, just before his 14th birthday. Extraordinary to think that, such a young lad. The plan had been for him to be taken in by his maternal uncle, Gilbert Pashley, but unfortunately he died. But his widow and her new husband did meet John and took him off to the fort at Vellore, where he was appointed ensign to the Madras regiment. And he got his first military assignment in 1784 at the end of the Second War with Tipu, when a company army under a Major Dallas was sent to collect the prisoners. At the border, they were met by 200 sepoys who were to escort them to Madras. Major Dallas asked to be taken to their commanding officer. "I am the commanding officer," said John Malcolm, aged 15. Well, bumptiousness was a characteristic throughout his life, and we'll see many instances of it. He was a boisterous youth, described as being full of animal spirits, adept at all games and a capital shot, and an idle and wild cadet. And his nickname, which stuck to him all his life, was Boy Malcolm. He was big, eventually 6'3", 15 stone. Unfortunately, after the Mysore War, there wasn't much to do, and he took to gambling, losing a whole load of money, and it was nearly the end of his career. But with support from his elder brother, he managed to clear his debts. But his family, and later the East India Company, always thought him extravagant and never trusted him with money. However, despite that, he had a long and very successful career, which we don't really have much time to look at in detail. So I'll focus on the early years because I think they give a good idea of the nature of the man. Lord Cornwallis became Governor-General in 1786 with greatly increased powers under Pitt's India Act of 1784. And he set about implementing the treaty between the East India Company and the Nizam of Hyderabad, whereby the company would raise and maintain a force of troops, and the Nizam would either pay them in cash or by ceding territory. It was an early version of the sort of treaties of subsidiarity that we saw in Rajasthan, which were negotiated by Todd 30 years later. And this arrangement effectively gave the company control over the ruler's defence and foreign policy. Cornwallis appointed Sir John Kennaway as the first resident of the court of the Nizam. So this is immediately before the Kirkpatrick brothers of White Mughal fame. And he also created 2 new battalions to form the Nizam's subsidiary forces, one of which, based near Masulipatam, John Malcolm went to. In 1790, the Third Anglo-Mysore War began, and the Nizam's forces were sent to invade Mysore. This was John Malcolm's first experience of war, and it was not pleasant. The fighting force numbered around 20,000, but with camp followers, there were said to be 500,000 people covering an area of country 10 miles long and 3 miles wide. And they just laid waste everywhere they went. He wrote to his sister, Nancy, "It is 500 miles. This is the map I showed you before. It is 500 miles from Masulipatam. Our road was terrible, all rocks and deserts, in the hottest season that perhaps was ever known. The thermometer at 115 for nearly a month. I walked nearly the whole way as my horse was sick. We were sometimes greatly stressed for provisions, often 40 or 50 hours without anything, but that was little compared to the dreadful want of water on the road. I've seen men raving mad, going into high fever and die in a few hours." Remember, this is a really young man still seeing this. And things didn't get much better when they reached Tipu's territory. They settled into the siege of the fort at Kopal, which lasted 6 months. And Malcolm was shocked by the ill-discipline, rapacity and cruelty of the Nizam's troops towards the local people. And he came to realise that the movement of armies is more often a scene of chaos, breakdowns, failures of communication, panic, than the smoothly planned sequences that one reads about in military manuals or the memoirs of retired generals. Then the monsoon started, and Cornwallis decided to make a tactical retreat back to Bangalore and to return the following year to attack Seringapatam. Malcolm, quite unsurprisingly, considering what he'd been through, fell ill and had to go to the coast to recuperate. And at this time, he seems to have studied Persian. So by the time Tipu had been defeated in February 1792, he was able to act as interpreter in the peace negotiations, which were conducted by Kennaway. They're quite impressive, really. Unfortunately, he fell ill again, and this time he was advised to travel home by sea. And he sailed on the same ship as Kennaway, and they became friends for life. I think Malcolm was very good at making friends, one of the things you see right through his life. It was Kennaway who instilled in Malcolm the ambition to rise above regimental soldiering and his lowly background and become a famous man. And according to J.M., fame seems to have been the spur which drove him, but his too blatant pursuit of it ultimately curbed his full achievement. One of his brothers described him as over-sanguine, and it was a fault which Malcolm recognised, writing to one of his sisters, "You know, I can be the most serious man on earth when I assume the character. I've not found it necessary for more than 5 hours in my life." His descendant speculates that as a warm-hearted extrovert, this is a bit for you, Liz. As a warm-hearted extrovert and natural linguist, not motivated by any strong religious conviction, he met his youthful sexual needs with compliant Indian women, as did his brother and uncle. But he did have a much more serious side, and he read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and translated the poems of Hafez from Persian. Unlike Elphinstone, Malcolm recognised the need for intelligence to keep the company informed about what was going on in the native courts. And he explained to Kenaway that he employed people in both the Nizam's and Tipu's courts and advocated the setting up of a coordinated intelligence department in Madras. He was certainly ahead of his time in that. By 1798, he was getting bored and wanted to use his talents as a political agent in a native court. Ever pushy, he urged his supporters to advance his claims with the incoming governor of Madras, Lord Clive. And in December 1799, he got his reward. He was sent as an envoy to Persia, ostensibly to promote goodwill and to improve trade between Persia and the company, but in reality to prevent Zaman Shah of Afghanistan from invading India and to get the Shah of Persia to act vigorously and heartily against the French in the event that they attempted to reach India overland. It was the first of 3 missions to Persia, and the catchphrase, "Send Malcolm," became more than a joke. And I think it was certainly a measure of the high regard the Governor-General had for Malcolm's diplomatic skills. He was still only 30 at this point. On his return, he was appointed private secretary to Lord Wellesley, replacing Henry. And Richard's management style, or lack of it, meant that the secretaries had a lot of power and responsibility. There were also some rather unenviable tasks. And Malcolm was sent to Hyderabad to sort out the Kirkpatrick scandal. James Kirkpatrick believed that Malcolm was out to ruin him, and their relationship never recovered. Malcolm, of course, had many adventures. Now, on one occasion, he was kidnapped on his way to Bombay, but struck up such a good relationship with his captors that they put on an entertainment for him, including comic dancers imitating sheep and fowls, and, perhaps even funnier, an English lady dancing a minuet. Malcolm, of course, was in his element, and I'm guessing he was probably sorry to be rescued. But then the end of the Wellesley era, all 3 brothers had returned to England, and that left Malcolm out of favour in government circles and depressed about both the political situation in India and his own career and finances. At this point, he thought of going home, but 2 letters from Arthur Wellesley put him off. One of them stated clearly, "You are not yet sufficiently rich." But his luck changed, and he fell in love with Charlotte Campbell, took her for a ride on an elephant and whispered a stream of anecdotes into her ear, which had her laughing helplessly. And his future father-in-law wrote to him, "Were the choice of all the men in India on offer for my daughter, I would have pitched on you." It got off to a good start. And Malcolm seems to have adored Charlotte, and they had 5 children, but she was not well liked, and she seems to have refused to allow the children any contact with the Malcolm relations. Malcolm, as I've said, went on 2 further missions to Persia, and on his return, he spent some time in Bombay, where, with the encouragement of James Mackintosh, he started to write his history of Persia. Mackintosh seems to have had mixed feelings about Malcolm, especially his table manners at breakfast. Malcolm rode up to Poona and visited Elphinstone, who was similarly engaged in writing his history of Afghanistan. They went off hunting, spent hours on horseback, having a great time. Malcolm's first child was born in 1811, and the family sailed for India, where they remained for 4 years. Charlotte never returned to India. But Malcolm pestered the Wellesleys to intervene with Canning to try and get him the governorship of Bombay. And he sailed alone to India in October 1816, still hoping that he might get that coveted appointment within the year. Malcolm was immediately summoned to Calcutta by the new Governor-General, Francis Rawdon, who's the Marquis Hastings, who wanted Malcolm's opinion on what to do about the Pindaris. The aim of the British was to extirpate the Pindaris, but the Marathas interpreted their massing of troops as threatening their territories. And this, of course, resulted in another Anglo-Maratha war. Malcolm was sent off to Pune to meet the Peshwa, who had been restored to his throne by the British, having been ousted by Holkar, leaving him resentful of both. And it's then that the difference in personality between Elphinstone, then the resident in Pune, and Malcolm came to the fore. Peshwa invited Malcolm to visit him, saying he was his last friend among the English, and he persuaded Malcolm that he would assist the English in their fight against the Pindaris, and that he therefore needed to build up his military strength. Malcolm, always seeing the best in people, believed the Peshwa was sincere and backed his demand for more troops. Elphinstone, who had already experienced Baji Rao's changes of mood, was sceptical, and the two friends agreed to differ. Arthur Wellesley had once remarked of Baji Rao, the only principle of his conduct is his insincerity. And of course, Elphinstone and Arthur were proved right, and the Peshwa used his troops to attack and burn the British residency, destroying all Elphinstone's books and papers. And there then ensued the Battle of Kirki, which, against all the odds, Elphinstone won. And that was the beginning of the last of the Anglo-Maratha wars. Malcolm distinguished himself in this war, and at the end of it, he was confident that he would fulfill his dream to become the governor of Bombay. In mid-March 1819, while he was still at the siege of Asirgarh, he learned from the Morning Chronicle that the next governor of Bombay was to be Mount Stuart Elphinstone. He was devastated and didn't hide his feelings. Malcolm was 10 years older, and he could point to a longer and more brilliant record of achievements. By this time, governors were generally recruited from the ranks of the aristocracy, and I think Malcolm didn't quite accept that, irrespective of any experience in India. So in fact, this appointment was unusual in that it was generally agreed that the choice should be between Elphinstone, Malcolm and Munro. Elphinstone had distinguished himself as an administrator in the settlement of the Deccan, and Malcolm, more of a military man, was much more controversial, having been closely linked to Wellesleys' now discredited forward policy. It was probably that meant that he didn't get the governorship of Bombay. He didn't disguise his feelings from his friend either. But he then went into a job at which he really excelled, in charge of military and political affairs in Central India, which included the whole of Malwa. And it led to the publication of his best-known book, the 2-volume memoir of Central India. It was a challenging task, analogous to Todd's in Rajasthan, at the same time dealing with the aftermath of the Anglo-Maratha and Pindari wars over a vast and diverse territory. Malcolm wrote home to Charlotte, "I wish you were here to enjoy the blessings I obtain from the poor inhabitants, who all continue to refer their happiness to me, and it joys my heart to find myself the instrument of punishing freebooters and restoring great provinces to a prosperity they have not known for years." So very similar to the wording that we saw in the Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan with Todd. J.M. says that his unrestrained, boastful enthusiasm was infectious. He got through a huge amount of work and the locals all adored him, but his staff found him exhausting. In the heat of summer, he retreated from his headquarters in Indore to Mandu, which we're going to see, an ancient ruined city on a high rocky outcrop. And he set up his home, I thought rather charmingly, in a little ruined palace. And it was ruined then. And it's got this touching little sign outside it, Malcolm's Cutty. He also went and visited Todd in Rajasthan. He was apprehensive that he would come rather in the shape of too large a fish into the sea of his glory. But in the event, they got on well. And after a visit to Bombay, where he stayed with Elphinstone, and during which he was much fettered, including being invested with the Order of the Bath, he sailed for England for what everyone thought would be the last time. And Elphinstone gave a farewell party for him, which he said went off admirably well in all respects. I regret his departure, and we shall no doubt miss his spirits and good humour while we forget his noise and egotism. Only one thing, of course, could persuade him to make his fourth crossing to India, and towards the end of 1826, news came that Elphinstone was retiring. Finally, Malcolm got what he'd sought for so many years, and he sailed in the summer of 1827. We don't have time to review everything that Malcolm did as governor of Bombay, but despite his burning desire to get the post, he seems not to have wanted to live there. And he quickly bought a house at Dapuri, and he also spent a great deal of time at a hill station, which he loved, Mahabaleshwar, famous for its strawberries. Unfortunately, Malcolm's governorship was soured by a clash between the Bombay government and the judges of the Supreme Court of Bombay, largely over which jurisdiction applied in the territories gained from the Marathas. In the end, the Privy Council supported the position of the Bombay government, and Malcolm and Elphinstone before him were vindicated, but it really had soured both their times as governor of Bombay. I think for Malcolm it had perhaps been a case of careful what you wish for. So that finally brings us to Elphinstone, as can be deduced from his title. The Honourable Mount Stuart Elphinstone came from a very different background from John Malcolm or James Todd. His father was the 11th Baron Elphinstone, who'd served under Wolfe in Canada and become the governor of Edinburgh Castle. There are two 19th century biographies of Elphinstone. The earlier, in 2 volumes, was written by Thomas Edward Colebrook, so son of our Henry Thomas. And in fact, it's really more of a compilation of letters and excerpts from diaries than what we now think of as a biography. It was commenced in 1861, but not published until 1884, so 25 years after Elphinstone's death, in part because of doubt about whether he would have wanted his correspondence and journals to be published. Colebrook didn't look at any of the private correspondence, there being plenty of material without it. And in the main, the journals avoided mention of anything personal, even though it was clear they were never intended for publication. Very unlike Todd's personal narratives in the annals, which were designed for public consumption. Colebrook tells us in the introduction that the selection I have made from the journals has been sparing. In one respect, my task has been an easy one. There was nothing to keep back. Any expressions of anger or annoyance at the conduct of others are very rare, while the evidence these journals afford for the warmth and unselfishness of the writer's nature is so complete that the publication of the whole journal would do him honour. He tells us of the difficulties he had in deciphering the handwriting. Handwriting was bad, sometimes just a scrawl, though one can well understand it was intended for no eyes other than his own. Colebrook says he was essentially a man of thought as well as of action, for his love of letters and his thirst for knowledge was intense. And his second biographer, James Cotton, tells us Elphinstone travelled with 2 camel loads of books, so packed that he could lay his hands on any volume. He read prodigiously in several languages, including French, Italian, Greek, Latin, Persian, and also spoke many local languages. A week after the Battle of Assaye, he told a friend that he decided to read the whole of Shakespeare critically. You'd have thought he'd have been exhausted. And while he was the resident in Pune, he read Dante with a friend, Lady Hood, presumably the copy which ended up in the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. Cotton makes some interesting observations about Elphinstone and his contemporaries, Metcalfe, Munro and Malcolm. Their careers touched at many points, and Cotton comments that they never allowed ambition to interfere with their mutual friendship or to impair the high opinion they entertained of each other's abilities. But there are clearly moments when Malcolm must have really tried Elphinstone's patience. So he says, such were the foremost of that band of men trained in the school of Wellesley, who each contributed his share to the work of crushing the Maratha Confederation and making the power of the British supreme throughout India. I'm going to have to gloss over Elphinstone's career as we're running out of time. We've already looked at Elphinstone and Malcolm and the problems of the last of the Anglo-Maratha wars. The end of the Second Anglo-Maratha War, Wellesley recommended Elphinstone, who's still only 24, to become the resident at the court of Bonsai at Nagpur, which was a great honour and a good salary. And it's here that his dislike of intelligence or espionage came to the fore, and also his pessimism with regard to both his own abilities and to the course of politics. He wrote in his journal, "I do not get on well about intelligence. It appears to me indispensable to try to get it in every way, yet I do not like the ways intelligence is obtained. I hate anything that's secret and indirect, and abhor to do what I should be unwilling to avow. If the Rajah discovered that I was inquiring into the situation of his armies and the intrigues of his court, what should I say?" And this was a problem that he grappled with throughout his career. In 1808, he took over as resident at the court of Scindia. So at this point, he comes into the orbit of Todd, though at this point, Scindia is still peripatetic, even though he had captured the fort at Gwalior, and he describes the chaos of the camp, pay in arrears, and people struggling all over the countryside, stripping it bare. He then got sent off to, well, it's supposed to be to Kabul, but he never got as far as Kabul, but he went into Afghanistan. And sadly, we don't have time to look at that fascinating journey, which he wrote about in his history of Afghanistan. He was then made commissioner for the settlement of the Deccan. So this is in the period at the end of the Anglo-Maratha wars. And it must have been an extraordinarily challenging post, restoring order in the ravaged and defeated Maratha territories, covering a much bigger area than Todd did in Rajasthan. He assessed the civil and criminal justice systems in operation and considered it his duty to preserve as much as possible of the existing legal and administrative systems, even if it was not ideal, but best under all the circumstances and at the time. And so he supported the village panchayat system. A friend sent him a treatise of Jeremy Bentham's, which he later came to respect. But at the time he replied, "I have not, however, as much occasion as you suppose for instruction in the principles of legislation, and my employment is very humble. It is to learn which system is in force and to preserve it unimpaired. This, I think, ought to be the great duty of a provisional government, and I think I shall have done a great service to this country if I can prevent people making laws for it until it sees whether they want them." In February 1819, he learned that he had been selected to be the governor of Bombay, and he seems to have been less than elated. He said, "What I most fear is the climate, but the society, the nature of the business and the way it's conducted all have their share in my dislike." And I'm afraid that, miss them out, I'm afraid that he disliked Bombay as much as he had anticipated. Sorry. To get to a picture of Bombay. There we go. like a schoolboy longing for the end of term, he even made a calendar on which he ticked off the remaining Wednesdays. Wednesday was council day, the worst day of the week. The two most debated topics at that time were colonisation and education. And he's chiefly remembered for encouraging education. And I think it's important to see this in the context of education in England at that time. We tend to forget that it was only around this time that it was slowly being accepted that the state had a role in education. Voluntary organisations, most of them overtly Christian, had concerned themselves with educating children up to now. And it was only in 1833, so 10 years after the period that we're talking about with Elphinstone and Bombay, the reformed UK Parliament reluctantly agreed that the state had a duty to see that its citizens could read and write, and voted a paltry £20,000 towards teaching people. So he was way, way ahead of his time. The question in Bombay, of course, and in India more generally, was the extent to which we should educate the natives and in what language, and whether the aim should be to placate the elite by supporting their institutions or to educate the masses. And this, of course, was highly controversial. And Elphinstone had initially conciliated the Brahmins by setting up the Pune Hindu College. He'd been initially unsure of the value of providing free schools, but on his arrival in Bombay, he became president of a voluntary society which had the education of Indians as its main aim. And at that point, he made grants from public funds to support it. One particular member of council, Francis Warden, disapproved of using state funds for education, and Elphinstone dreaded his combative interventions. He said the government should not be too forward in taking the education of the natives on itself. In contrast, Elphinstone believed it was only through education at all levels of society that evils like sati, child marriage and debt, as well as apathy towards change, could be remedied. Education might not be the first priority, he wrote, but it was the key to all the other ones. And he didn't approve of conversion to Christianity. He was accused of being godless, which he clearly wasn't in the diaries. In 1826, he'd had enough. He was frustrated by the long dispute with the Supreme Court, which Malcolm inherited, and the lack of support for his educational plans. And he wanted to visit the classical sites of Greece and Rome for all his reading. So after a final tour of the Deccan, he resigned, and this time Malcolm was appointed to replace him and got what he wanted. There were many accolades from the natives, and Cotton comments that Oriental hyperbole here coincides with the language of truth. I thought rather more touchingly, Philip Woodruff considers Elphinstone to be one of the most selfless and lovable men who have ever achieved a name in the world of action. Thank you. References, if anybody wants them.
I'm going to have questions, I think.
I'm just talking about, I was just interested when you were talking about Malcolm and that he went to India when he was like 14 and this lack of education. I've just been looking at the provenance of our Persian manuscripts in the collection. And of course, there were a lot of manuscripts Persian manuscripts given by Malcolm. And I mean, they're really very good ones. And so he must have used them for his history of Iran, of Persia, and quite extensively.
Yes.
So his Persian was very good, I think.
Translated quite a lot of poetry.
Yeah, but some of them are quite obscure as well. There's a very obscure history of Isfahan.
These young men with no education. educated themselves effectively.
Well, yes, I mean, to a very, I mean, I would say quite a high standard. Yeah. Do we have, oh, Peter?
Perhaps a little bit off topic, but en passant, you mentioned that Malcolm was sent to Hyderabad to deal with the James Kirkpatrick scandal and slid deftly across it. I just wondered what it was.
Yes, you need to read William Dalrymple's White Mughals to get all the gory details. But basically, James Kirkpatrick married a very young Muslim noble woman and had two children with her. So it was a scandalous relationship, and it was very much tied up with politics at the time as well. So it was a messy situation. And James Kirkpatrick and Malcolm had initially been really good friends, and Malcolm worked for him. So it was rather disastrous that he saw Malcolm as interfering in something which shouldn't have been the government's job. But anyway, I recommend hesitantly White Mughals to you.
Okay, I presume he sorted it out then, did he? And yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah. Oh. Give you.
Sorry, this is a terribly naive question. How many civil administrators did the company have in India at this time? We're talking tens, hundreds, or thousands?
There were 3 governorships based in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, and so under them there was another tier. Peter will probably answer this one.
Never counted them, but it's in the hundreds.
It's hundreds, yes. It's I'd have thought it's low hundreds.
Not
A lot of military. Well, and a huge overlap between military and civilian. Well, it's quite difficult to distinguish the two. Both Malcolm and Elphinstone did both.
He did a lot of authority.
Yes. Yeah.
These uneducated young men, Richard, I think it was, Wellesley, picked up an FRS. What for?
No idea.
Well, that's fairly frank.
I mean, he was aristocratic. He was educated. He'd been to Eton and Harrow and Oxford. So he's not one of the uneducated lads, not at all.
Right.
Indulgent on my part, but I was just going, isn't this the English way? I mean, it's not just there, it's I'm thinking, let's say,
You go along philosophy.
well, I'm thinking of, let's say, Kitchener, who ran the war until 1915. He's a completely uneducated person, yet he's said to be an excellent French speaker. He taught himself German, and his Arabic was obviously pretty good because Arabic speakers commented on his knowing different dialects and being able to address the troops in a colloquial style. I thought Britain just didn't educate it.
Definition of education was
The whole sort of political class. Only the sort of people in Parliament are educated, are they? Formally, you know, but I don't.
well, yes. I mean, formal education was only the very upper class.
But I'm suggesting, unlike, let's say, the German states, while are you continental color?
French.
Yes.
Hello. Sorry, we have a question from the chat.
Oh, yes. Okay. Do you want to go?
Yes. Hi. Yes. Can you tell me why Elphinstone is buried in Limpsfield, Surrey?
Yes, when he retired, he came back to England after his year of travels through Italy and Greece. And he initially lived in London, in Albany, but he hated living in London. He didn't like the crowds, the dirt. He didn't like parties. He was really big. He wanted to be a recluse. And so he rented a house called Hookwood, which is on the edge of Limpsfield village. And he lived there for 12 years before he died. And so he died in Limpsfield.
Are there any other questions?
Do you want to
No,
make
I
a
was just
comment?
going-
Yeah.
I was going to comment and ask a question about this education. A lot of people went, British people, English people, and Scots and Irish people went to India very young, initially as midshipmen on the ships.
Yeah.
And they certainly from 10 or 11 onwards could be doing that. There were also people who had education in various schools and so on and went out as well. And the interesting thing about your generation that you're talking about is that these people seem to me to be pretty well near the end of that kind of
Yes.
recruit. I mean, for a start, when they start recruiting formally, they require education and there are exams and so on. I mean, even before the East India Company is over, in the 1820s and 30s and they're onwards, they're expecting, and people who are not educated are the subject of criticism. And there are people who say, what's wrong with this administration is we don't have properly educated and trained people. Yes, exactly. And then that led to the Indian Civil Service. So it's interesting that you talked about 1830s being the period at which education became a government responsibility. And it's interesting that this is a different era these people come from.
Yeah.
And I think you would agree that they're not, it's not what they're like later. And also quaintly or counterintuitively, these educated people are much less good at learning foreign languages. It's maybe something to do with a very old tradition of what's wrong with the British education system, as sponsored by the state and others. Yes.
We will wrap up now. So just leaves us to thank you very, very much.
Sorry, thank you. We just have one more question
Oh,
from
one
the
more
chat,
question,
if you
right.
have time. Thank you.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. To what extent did European perspectives, such as the stadial theory in its more religious form, influence figures like Malcolm?
I think very little in that generation, but even a decade later, everything had changed. And as Peter said, this was a very different era from the mid 19th century when, you know, Elphinstone and Malcolm and Munro all said in so many words, we think that conversion of Indians to Christianity is wrong. And that was not the case a decade later. Quite the reverse.
Okay.
Thank you. We actually have just two more questions, if you don't mind. Following up on the earlier question, can you speak a little bit about what was the reaction of the company directors to approving the funds for the education of their Indian subjects when free or even compulsory education was not yet possible in England?
Well, that is not recorded. I suspect that what happened, as so often in India, the man on the ground, in this case Elphinstone, just got on with it, and the company directors wouldn't have found out until many months later when the mail got through, and by then it was a bit late to stop it.
Okay, and just one more, thank you. Fort William College was set up by Richard Wesley. Was this to address the education issue?
No, it was to make administrators and soldiers for the East India Company.
Okay, that's fine. So we just need to thank Liz very, very, very much, and it really was very good. A very good prelude to our forthcoming trip. So thank you very much. Thank you.